In this video, we will be exploring the themes of taxation and finance during the reign of Peter the Great, the causes for the taxes he brought in and what those taxes consisted of, namely how much they were and how they affected the people of Russia. To begin, we must ask ourselves one simple question: why did Russia need money? Essentially, in the late 17th century, Russia was incredibly poor as a nation due to the fact that its outgoings are fairly high and its trade with others was virtually non-existent. The ambitions of Peter the Great also required vast sums of money if any of them were actually going to come to fruition. The first main reason was the Great Northern War. The Great Northern War was a massive conflict between Sweden, Russia, Poland, Denmark, and a whole mixed bag of other nations that took place between 1700 and 1721. In essence, Sweden had a new king called Charles VII who was really young, and everyone else saw it as the perfect time to overthrow the mighty Swedes. Charles was a very unorthodox king for the time, for he wasn't keen on all the pomp and fancy of the role he was expected to play, instead preferring to live life like a soldier. He felt that all of the other ruling families were doing it wrong and decided he was going to punish them all by going to war with them and killing them. An ulterior motive for the Russians was to take the Baltic states, which would therefore provide year-round access for them to the sea, something Peter wanted very much due to his love of boats. Now, unfortunately for Russia, war is incredibly expensive, and when you're a nation that's essentially 2 centuries out of date, the cost can be a bit much. On a side note, they won, but let's get back to the relevant things. Number 2. Military reforms. Russia was very weak in a militaristic sense, with very little in terms of well-trained troops, despite having an absolutely huge number of them. The Streltsky were not really an option due to Peter's completely founded hatred of them, and this therefore meant that Russia could not hope to compete with its neighbours in Western Europe, as the majority of them were incredibly advanced military-wise, in particular Sweden, who were at the time incredibly militaristic. Russia also had no navy, which was something that Peter desired greatly. Furthermore, to develop said army and navy, he wanted to get in experts in the areas to teach Russians how to make and use machinery that would put them on the international stage as a nation not to be messed with. These military and maritime reforms that he had in mind were things that were going to cost a lot of money. A lot of money. Russia had also lost vast quantities of arms, as in weapons, in previous wars that they had lost miserably, meaning that they had to replace said weapons. Again, this was something that obviously would not come cheaply, but was imperative if they wanted to have any form of power at all. Number 3. Westernization. Peter the Great was essentially a Western European man trapped inside a very rich, very tall Russian body. He loved everything about Western Europe, a love that he had developed during the Grand Embassy of 1697 to 98, and felt that the best way to enhance Russia would be to essentially plagiarize everything about the European powers. The majority of Western European nations were very wealthy, meaning that if Russia was going to copy the structures and qualities of the nations, it would also need a lot of money. Such westernizing reforms would include the previously mentioned military reforms, changes in dress, changes in industry, and a more open foreign policy that would further encourage international trade. So how did the Russian government fund all of these extravagant changes? Well, the answer is fairly simple. Did what any good establishment would do and taxed the hell out of its people. And that brings us on to our next section. The main tax imposed by Peter was something called the soul tax, which was essentially a tax on all males save for a minority of nobles and clergymen. Introduced in the November of 1718, the tax eventually raised 4.6 million rubles per year, as opposed to the relatively measly 1.6 million raised per year before its introduction. It took 6 years to come to fruition, as it needed a census of every male in Russia, something that took a long time because of the large population, and was eventually completed in 1724. This particular tax was interesting due to the fact that everybody who paid it had to pay the same amount, meaning that it went some way to make things a little more equal for everybody. If a peasant were to flee their village to escape paying said tax, the rest of the village had to pay it in their place, giving people an incentive to make sure those around them paid the tax, giving the tax an estimated 96% collection rate. Prior to the soul tax came one of Peter's more ingenious ideas. In the late 17th century, basically every man in Russia had a beard. It was just the done thing. Many had them for religious reasons, but others had them simply because they liked beards. Peter picked up on this and realised that an incredibly easy way to make a large amount of money would be to simply charge everybody who sported a beard. This killed two birds with one stone in his eyes, as not only did it mean he could gather a great deal of money by not doing very much, but he could also bring Russians more in line with Western fashions, with beards no longer being a particularly trendy accessory in the high courts of the Western world. This reform did not only target nobles, but everybody in the country, albeit to different extents. Peasants were charged 1 kopeck every time they went into a city, with nobles and merchants being charged 60 rubles a year, and particularly wealthy merchants being charged 100 rubles per year. Those who had paid their dues and chose to remain bearded also had to carry around a token saying that they had in fact earned their beard. This token had printed on it the wonderfully blunt, "The beard is a superfluous burden." Safe to assume that Peter was not a massive fan of beards. Other tax introduced under Peter's new reforms included the bee tax and the bathing tax, both introduced in 1704, that dealt with beekeeping and public bathing respectively. The taxes introduced in Peter's reign as Tsar increased the annual revenue of the Russian government by around 600% in just under 30 years, going from just over 1 million rubles in 1694 to 3.5 million in 1701, then going all the way up to 8.5 million in 1724, just a year before his death. This was without a doubt what allowed Peter to go through with his reforms, and what allowed him to bring Russia into the forefront of the world stage. So yeah, that's about it for finance and taxation under Peter the Great. We hope you enjoyed this informative video, and thank you very much for watching.